Good evening. I am Dr. Jasper VanDrayson, and I am the Afterlife Coach. Tonight we continue our investigation of the Brownstone School, abandoned, surrounded by 4 dead towns, steeped in tragedy, filled with horrors from which we are only protected by the thin miasma of the now. These dark and deserted halls, once filled with vibrant and shimmering life, are choked with silence and dread. The brownstone has tasted the blood of man, and, one feels, is hungry for more. Captain Clive Carpenter, head of the state police, arrived at the brownstone shortly after the discovery of the 13 corpses on the lower floor of the school. He was involved in every aspect of the investigation of this horrific slaughter. Captain Carpenter had extensive forensics background, which put him in a position which is rare for most police captains. There was no aspect of the investigation that escaped his attention or contribution. The victims, as I mentioned before, gave no indication of conforming to a pattern. The youngest victim was determined to be approximately 13 years of age. The oldest victim appeared to be in their mid-60s. 9 males, 4 females. As only 3 of the victims were able to be positively identified, a great deal of assumptions had to be made. For example, judging from clothing alone, there appeared to be a wide range of economic backgrounds among the victims, from poorly made, cheap clothing to a fine, hand-tailored suit. Again, nothing that linked or associated these victims one to the other. The medical examiner quickly determined that all the victims, while bearing comparatively superficial contusions and injuries, had died as a result of having their jugular veins severed. These cuts were very precise, penetrating just deep enough to sever those vital arteries, extending across the neck from side to side. These fatal wounds were inflicted, it was determined, by an incredibly sharp object wielded with surgical precision. It spoke of an amazing level of calm and control on the part of the killer. The captain feared that they were dealing not with a crazed, emotional aberrant, but rather with a cold-blooded, inhuman monster. While assumptions could be made from the fact that all of these bodies were found in the same location and with startling similarities of cause of death, there is still a chance that, horrifying as it may seem, it could all be a coincidence. Captain Carpenter himself discovered the link that firmly tied these victims to each other. On each victim, on the right side of the neck, just above the wound to the jugular and throat, an additional wound, or in some cases, wounds, appeared. Each victim had a number scratched, or rather clawed into the flesh. Each of the victims had a sequential number, 1 through 13, clawed into their skin. The state of decomposition of each body seemed to confirm that the numbers were sequential in every sense of the word, indicating that the earliest victim was labeled with the number 1, and the latest victim, determined to have been deceased less than an hour when initially discovered, bearing the most unlucky number 13. Immediately following this discovery, Captain Carpenter began a massive manhunt throughout the 4 townships and surrounding areas. Despite all the funding and resources of the state police, and tireless efforts by Captain Carpenter and his crew, no trace of the murderer, and consequently, no leads to follow up on. The case went cold. It was as if the killer simply vanished from the face of the earth. No physical evidence, no genetic detritus, nothing left behind. Captain Carpenter retired following the closing of this case. The failure to make any sense of these brutal killings burdens his conscience to this day. That's where I come in. Captain Carpenter contacted my office, having discovered my name in association with a cold case that I was asked to consult on, the case of a missing young lady named Alicia a few years back. I ultimately chose not to involve myself in this, but not before a hometown newspaper had written an article mentioning my name. The captain asked if I would visit the brownstone and determine if the ectoplasmic ether carried any impressions or vibrations of this killer, anything that might point to a motive, a meaning, or even better, an identity. Having, of course, heard of the brownstone and the horrific tragedies that had played out there, I jumped at the opportunity. I traveled to the brownstone immediately, accompanied by my interns, Cindy and Chuck. I first went to the mechanical room of the school, the location of the mysterious death of the school janitor. I needed to examine the locations of the lesser tragedies that had occurred at the brownstone. Only by identifying and isolating the spectral impressions created by these events can I hope to separate them from the vibrations of the larger scene I was here to research, the main event, as it were. The echoes of the janitor's demise are distant, dreamlike, unsubstantial. It feels as if the vibrations have been destroyed somehow, withered, burnt. A very unusual feeling, and one that I had not encountered before. I continued my investigation in the gymnasium, site of the murder of the 4 students and the suicide of their assailant. The other side called very strongly here. The veil is so thin that one can almost see through it. The shape of the poor students can be felt around one as one stands in the echoing darkness of the gymnasium. The way in which the children cry out is brutal, almost physically unbearable. I cut my research here short, as I am confident that I can identify that set of impressions if I ever encounter them again. While unpleasant, it will aid me in isolating any frequencies emanating from the numbered killings. I was taken aback slightly when I discovered that the stairway that the guidance counselor had drunkenly fallen down was the same one that Deputy Morgan descended to discover the first of the numbered victims. As I descended that stairway and proceeded down the hallway the state police had dubbed the meat locker, I could feel the pull of the other realm as I stood in the place where each victim had died, their frightened whimpering, their whispered pleas for mercy that fell on cold, deaf ears. As I traveled down the hallway, past earlier and earlier victims, I became aware of a flicker, a wisp on the edge of my sight. As I moved farther into the past, as it were, that flicker grew stronger and began to resolve itself into a more distinct form. As I approached the spot that victim number 3 had lain, I could tell that the shape of the flicker had become that of a man, apparently clad in dark clothing, but his facial features remained indistinct, unrecognizable, blank, its head turned away to its left, as if looking farther down the hallway. This shape remained motionless to my left side against the wall. Even as I moved towards the location for victim number 2, the shape remained motionless still, but keeping pace with me, seemingly floating as I walked. I was suddenly struck by the realization that, from the moment the shape solidified, I was no longer hearing the call of the other side. It seemed to me that all of the noise, all of the vibrations from the murder that were enveloping me on all sides, all of this was gone now. And it also seemed to me that all of that had been sucked into the shape, that the shape was like a black hole, gathering all of the despair, pain, terror, anguish, and compressing it into its very core. Standing on the very spot that victim number 2 had been found, I noticed that the shape had gained a little more form, but not definition. While I still could not make out any details, the shape seemed more real, more present than before. I felt a great pressure upon my body, my limbs reluctant and heavy to move, a massive headache forming just behind my eyes. As I tried to move, to step farther down the hall, the shape turned its head towards me. The only feature I could discern were 2 eyes, black as the night, black as the deeps of the oceans, that seemed to pulsate and glisten. As those eyes turned on me, I was struck by a force the likes of which I've never encountered and, God's willing, never will again. I was thrown to the ground by the force of all the voices of the departed just on the other side of the veil. Their cries pounded into my brain like 1,000 needles. The pain of it caused my body to shut down. My interns, Shiloh and Cam, found me a short while later. After I regained my feet, I was pulled to a spot near the stairway. As I approached the stairs, this feeling of compulsion grew, drawing me to a dark spot, a small cubbyhole about ground level at the junction of two walls. I would never have noticed it had I not been under the influence of this pull, this attraction. I can safely say the state police did not notice it in the course of their work. The brownstone investigation was not a success in the traditional sense. I could not identify the killer. However, my work there is not done. I will return to the brownstone, and I will continue to investigate. The powers I felt in that building are inexplicable. This is the strongest locus of the alternate world I have ever encountered. The veil is not just thin there. The veil does not exist. My biggest concern, no. My biggest fear is this. The veil is one way. If there's no veil, there's no door. Did something come through? I didn't identify the killer, but I think I may be beginning to understand him. In that little cubbyhole under the stairs, I found this.